What's this, guys? What is this thing?
That is called the
No, the whole thing. That is the nephron. And what's this? Sac nephron. Yeah,
oh my god. I didn't even see it.
No, you'll never forget. Oh, is he her honey? Yeah. Well, he's not a bad specimen of humanity, if I'm being honest. Okay, so we're going to finish urinary system and start reproductive system today. Okay. So we did all of the hard parts of the urinary system. So now we are going to start with the ureters, right? But here's, just do this for me, okay? Get me from a collecting duct to a ureter. I'm ready. Go.
The ureter?
It's almost right. It's a papilla. Renal papilla, yes. Minor calyx. Major calyx. Ureter. Right, so that's where we are now. Okay, so let's talk about your ureters. That sounds funny. Okay, so the ureters are going to begin usually about L2, although, of course, the right one's a little lower. Yes? Okay. Going to begin about L2, and they are going to begin at the hilus or hilum of the kidney, which is the little indentation where all the tubes kind of go. And they are going to start out retroperitoneal because the kidneys are retroperitoneal. Yeah? Does that make sense? And they stay retroperitoneal until the sacroiliac joint. You may have never heard that before, but I'm pretty sure you can figure out what the hell I'm talking about. Sacroiliac joint, right? And then they pop into the peritoneal cavity of the sacroiliac joint. Good? Okay, so let's look at what they're made of and what they do. So this is going to be the first time that you see transitional epithelium. You learn transitional epithelium as lining the urinary bladder, but it actually starts in the ureters, and it's in the urinary bladder and part of the urethra. Good? Okay. So the urethra can actually stretch and can get full, and then it can get fuller. Yeah? Like if your kidneys are generating a whole bunch of urine and your urinary bladder is already full, your ureters can get a little fuller. So what else are you going to find in there besides transitional epithelium? You are going to find a middle muscularis layer, which is smooth muscle. You've got a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. And those are going to move urine by peristalsis. So do you see the layer of smooth muscle in between the two of them? So why is peristalsis important? We're thinking, oh, well, we're standing up, so urine's always going to move. Well, first of all, you ain't always standing up. And then second, you are not evolved from standing up critters, right? So we have to be able to move our urine via peristalsis regardless of body position, right? So it's going to move because of contraction of the smooth muscle. And then as far as the outer layer is not serous membrane because these are actually stuck to other structures as they go by. So instead of being serosa, it's adventitia, which is connective tissue, right? So when you see the ureters in the cadaver, it's because we pulled them out for you so that you could see them. They were all stuck to structures when they were going by. Does that make sense? Okay. Note, the transitional epithelium that is lining everywhere that we're going to talk about transitional epithelium is connected by tight junctions. Somebody make that make sense to me. Why would you want tight junctions there? Yeah, especially that stuff. Do you want your urine leaking back into your peritoneal cavity? That's going to be a bad day, right? You're not going to feel so well that day. Go ahead.
They're same, the muscle that's longitudinal and circular,
Mm-hmm.
is it the same that it's inner on your bowel too, and the outer is circular?
Yeah, the longitudinal is the inner layer, then you've got a circular, but this one actually has an extra outer longitudinal layer. But that's a general pattern that quite often you have. And sometimes you'll have an extra layer, like we will see in the urinary bladder, you have very thick 3 layers in the urinary bladder. But that's a common pattern that you see. It's good for peristalsis. Okay, so now we are going to move to the urinary bladder. All right, so go ahead.
So when you get a kidney transplant, they usually leave the other kidney in the body. But if they have to take it out for whatever reason, how would they connect the new kidney to the ureter?
Oh, it's easy.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, as long as you're not connecting nerves. Connecting tubes is honestly, I could do it. You might even live through it, I'm not sure. I definitely wouldn't look to me first, but if we're in the zombie apocalypse and you need a kidney transplant, I'll totally volunteer. Okay, so when you hook up tubes, you just basically have to hook them back together. So hooking blood vessels, totally cool. Hooking ureters, totally cool. Hooking nerves, nobody knows what the hell they're doing. They're just lying if they say they do, right? Okay, so urinary bladder. It is a collapsible muscular sac. So here's what it looks like when it's empty, and here's what it looks like when it's full. It holds up to a pint. When it gets full, it extends upwards, okay? You do not have dramatically different sizes of your urinary bladder. So you don't actually have a small bladder, you're just really responsive to bladder stretch. So we'll talk about that at the end. Our urinary bladder sizes do not vary very much. So let's look at where it is in a mid-sagittal section. So if you look at a mid-sagittal section in a female, you can see that the urinary bladder is really kind of stuck into the connective tissue in the pelvic cavity. Do you see that? So if you look at it in a cadaver, you're not really going to see it flopping around. All you'll see is the top surface of it, right? Joe, one of the lab aides on Redwood campus, dissected one out completely so that you can pull it out and you can open it up and see what's inside. But generally, when you look inside a cadaver, inside a person, it's going to look like there's hardly anything there. You'll just see the top, right, of the urinary bladder. So it's kind of all stuck in there, okay? In a female, of course, the location of the urinary bladder, notice the location of the uterus and the urinary bladder. This is going to matter when you get pregnant, right? Okay. It also should make you nicer to pregnant people. Because what happens when you get pregnant is that uterus, right, can gain ultimately 25, 30 pounds, right? Even in the early stages when you get pregnant, it starts increasing blood flow to the uterus. And what happens to the uterus is it pushes down on the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder pushes against the pubic symphysis. So it can't really expand upwards very well. Does that make sense? Okay? So you end up having to pee 4 or 5 times a night, right? As if you weren't uncomfortable enough, right? And you have to get up and pee 4 or 5 times a night. Notice that in a male, you're golden. You got all kinds of room for expansion up there, right? So if she has to pee on a road trip, you'd be nice, right? You'd be nice because somebody kept you alive that entire time to give birth to you. Okay, so it's almost spherical when it's full. It sits on the pubic symphysis. It can store about a pint of urine, and its job is to expel urine. So let's look at the openings, and then we'll look at the muscle in it. Okay, so go back here. Okay, we have openings to the urinary bladder. So even though the ureters come in and sort of contact the urinary bladder at the top, they actually don't dump into the urinary bladder until about the bottom 1/3. So they just sort of run along the backside for a little while. Does that make sense? And then they dump right here. So these are the openings to the ureters, yes? And this is the opening to the urethra. And what you end up with is a triangle there called the urinary trigon. And the urinary trigon has anatomical variabilities in some people. It's a little deeper, yes? And if it's a little deeper, it's a little bit more likely to be susceptible to recurring urinary tract infections. So for instance, if you have a bunch of people in your family with recurring urinary tract infections, and you're pretty sure they all know how to wipe properly, because that's important, right? Ladies, right? We know that. And if somebody didn't teach you, they did you wrong, right? Right? You're going to get some E. coli up in there and get yourself some UTIs. But if you know how to wipe properly and you get recurring UTIs, especially in a whole family, my husband's sisters all get UTIs. And I was like, can we talk about wiping for a minute? And they're like, oh my God. I just had to make sure. Basically, your urinary trigon, if it's really deep, then it doesn't get cleansed as well. And if you also are female and you have a relatively short urethra, then it's really not very hard for external bacteria to get up in there, and then they basically sort of get recurring UTIs, okay? There are other behaviors that can increase the likelihood of your recurring UTIs, but some of it's just anatomy. Okay, so that's the urinary trigon. Now let's look at the tissue and the muscle that makes it up. You guys already know the tissue that lines the urinary bladder. It's transitional epithelium. You've known that for a while. It's got tight junctions in it. And then deep to the transitional epithelium, you're going to have some connective tissue, and then you are going to have smooth muscle. You've got 3 layers of smooth muscle, and they're all relatively thick. The urinary bladder is actually pretty thick. So you got 3 layers of smooth muscle. Collectively, all of the smooth muscle in the urinary bladder is called the detrusor muscle. So for instance, if you want to empty your urinary bladder, you contract your detrusor muscle. Does that make sense? Okay. Collectively, it's all called the detrusor muscle. And then around the outside, remember, it's all stuck into the connective tissue down there. So the outer layer is not serous membrane, it's adventitia, which is connective tissue. Good? Okay, so innervation of the urinary bladder. It's got motor innervation and sensory innervation. Its motor innervation is via the autonomic nervous system going to the smooth muscle in the wall of the bladder. Good? And what do you guys think? Think about this before you answer. Which branch of the autonomic nervous system should cause contraction of the detrusor muscle? Should it be the sympathetic or the parasympathetic branch? It's the parasympathetic branch. Now, I know some of you guys are thinking, well, but what about people who pee when they get scared? When you pee when you get scared, you are actually losing control of the skeletal muscle sphincter at the bottom. Because you're like, oh, crap! Or when your dog gets super duper excited to see you when you come in. Does your dog actually dump his entire urinary bladder on the floor, or is it just a couple dribbles? Just a couple dribbles, right? Still a little unpleasant, makes everybody feel weird, right? But it's just a couple dribbles. So you do not actually contract that with sympathetic stimulation. You contract it with parasympathetic stimulation. Now, your urinary bladder also has sensory innervation, and it's visceral sensory innervation, yeah? And the visceral sensory innervation means that you can feel when the thing is stretched. And you know you can feel when it's stretched, right? You can feel when it's stretched a little, and you might be able to get through the class, and you can feel where you're going to pee down your leg if you don't go pee real soon, right? And eventually it will actually start to hurt. And we'll talk about the micturition, the urinating response in just a second. So, blood supply to the urinary bladder is from the internal iliac arteries, and it's drained by the internal iliac veins, which shouldn't surprise any of you. Now we are going to talk about the urethra. Okay, so let's talk about your urethra. Okay, so the urethra, you can see the basics of it right here. It's going to vary. So the ureters don't vary dramatically between the sexes. They're about 10 inches long in both sexes. They're going to be longer if you're taller, but that's really the only reason they would be longer, right? But the urethra is, of course, going to vary dramatically in length, but it's going to have some things in common between the sexes. The first is that the urethra starts at the end of the urinary bladder with an internal urethral sphincter. So here's your urethra, here's the bladder. The internal urethral sphincter is a smooth muscle sphincter, yeah, that goes all the way around, and its job is to keep urine in the urinary bladder until you're ready to urinate. And if it's really tight, it'll prevent dribbling. A lot of times there is a little bit of urine between the internal urethral sphincter and the external. And then if you get super excited, what happens? Just a little bit of squirt, squirt, right? Just a little bit, right? Like your dog, okay? So that's the internal urethral sphincter. It's smooth muscle. You're not in voluntary control of that one. And then the external urethral sphincter is right here. I'll show it to you in a mid-sagittal section in just a second. It's skeletal muscle. And that's your potty training muscle. Usually takes you the first 2 or 3 years of your life to figure out like how to control it. Because how do you tell somebody how to pee or not pee? You're just like, right? And you can't show them anything, right? So it's not really like very good at teaching. Eventually you will get it, right? I hope we've all got it. That's the external urethral sphincter. It takes a little while longer to develop control of it in males. So males usually potty train a little bit later than females, okay? They actually do everything a little bit later. And then they die sooner. What the hell? But then you also get paid 30% more than us, so I'm all right with it. Okay, so let's see. Tissue layers of the urethra. First let's look at the mid-sagittal section. Okay, so mid-sagittal section, let's find the urethra and find the locations. So here's the urinary bladder and here's the urethra, right? That's the external urethral orifice in females. Please note that in females, the urethra is anterior and pretty much parallel to the vagina. Do you see? Anterior and parallel. And notice that they are really kind of right next to one another and just separated by connective tissue. Everybody good with that? Okay. Of course, in the males, the urethra has a different anatomy. Not dramatically different until you leave the external urethral sphincter. So with the males, of course, here is where the internal urethral sphincter would be as well, right, at the bottom of the bladder. And then the urethra is going to run through the prostate gland, right? And then the external urethral sphincter would be right here. It's in that layer of skeletal muscle, same place in women. Here's where the external urethral sphincter would be. It's a layer of skeletal muscle at the bottom called the pubococcygeal muscles. Sometimes they call them the Kegel muscles, right? And the external urethral sphincter goes around the urethra there, and it's in the same location in males. It would be right in here, right? Okay. And then, of course, the urethra is going to have to go all the way to the external urethral orifice at the tip of the penis in males, right? So it's going to be far longer in males than it is in females. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So tissues, and then we'll go to anatomical differences. The tissue layers, go ahead.
I have a quick question
Okay.
about nocturnal enuresis.
Uh-huh.
If it is not a endocrine issue, could it be a sphincter issue?
When you're not actually producing urine when you're sleeping. What the hell could cause that except for endocrine? Because the production of urine is different than the expulsion of urine. Right, ADH levels, but I don't know of anything anatomical that could cause it, because the anatomical differences in the sphincter activity are not related to urine production. They're related to urine expulsion. So I don't know that isn't known, but I don't know it. So it might be known. I do understand the endocrine angle of it, but I don't understand the other one. Okay, so let's talk about the tissue layers, and then we'll talk about differences between sexes. Okay, first, the inner layer is transitional epithelium up near the bladder. In a female, the inner layer of the urethra will stay transitional epithelium the entire length, because the female urethra is only about 4 centimeters, or about 1.5 inches long in females, right? But in males, do you remember that it actually changes tissue type as you get to the end? So it's transitional epithelium through the urethra until about the distal 1/3, and then it changes to that tissue that you don't have very many places. Like, they either call it stratified columnar or pseudostratified columnar, but it's not ciliated, right? And it's that one that you don't really have other places. Does that make sense? So in the urethra of both males and females, in both kinds of tissue, transitional and the columnar one, they have mucus producing capacity, because you can produce the mucus that's inhospitable to bacteria, which means that it's protecting you from bacterial infections. So there are a lot more bacterial infections that you could get than you do. And of course, males, notice the distance until you get up to the urinary bladder. Males are going to get far fewer urinary tract infections than females are. In addition, you ain't got no wiping possibilities right there, unless you're doing something really weird. You ain't got no, right? Okay, so, all right, so external urethral sphincter, we talked about this. So that should be sex differences in the urethra. So sex differences in the urethra, let's talk about that. So in females, the urethra is about 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters long, and in a male, it is about 8 inches long. Now, I'm not telling you that a penis is about 8 inches long, because I do not want you to have those kinds of expectations for your life. I'm telling you, because notice there's a lot of urethra before you get to here. Do you see that? Right? So it averages about 8 inches long total, right? And it varies with the length of the penis, which varies. The length of the vagina varies too, but we don't seem to be very focused on that. Okay, so in females, it's about 1.5 inches long. It's stuck to the anterior wall of the vagina and the external urethral orifice. You have to be able to find it. You cannot leave this class without knowing, for instance, that females have 3 holes down there, and males have 2. And guess which sex tends to do worse on the reproductive? Oh my gosh, you guys don't know where any of your parts are. No wonder people are getting knocked up left, right, and center. You don't even know where the parts are, so let's figure out where the parts are. Okay, so first of all, external urethral orifice, okay, between the clitoris, which I hope you don't pass the 4th test unless you can find it, and the opening of the vagina is the external urethral orifice, right? That's where it is in females. Okay, so by the way, this structure is not a vagina. What is that? Vulva. That's a vulva, yes. There's far more to it. There's all kinds of magical crap in there that are not included in the vagina, and we're going to learn it all. Okay, and then in the male, of course, the external urethral orifice is right down here, right, at the tip of the glans penis, right? All right, so There are 3 sections, therefore, to the male urethra, and it is the prostatic urethra as it runs through the prostate, right? The membranous as it runs through the skeletal muscle, including the external urethral sphincter. And then as it goes through the penis, it's either called the penile urethra or the spongy urethra because it's surrounded by the corpus spongiosum. And either term is fine. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so now one big difference, and we'll see how it occurs today when we start going into this, is that in the male and the female, in the female, please note that the urethra and the reproductive structures are entirely separate in an anatomically typical female, okay? However, in an anatomically typical male, they are not. The male urethra carries both semen and urine, but not at the same time. And an anatomically and physiologically typical male, one of the things that happens that prevents that is that as soon as a male is aroused, the first thing that happens is internal urethral sphincter slams shut, right, tightly. And then what happens is the bulbourethral glands right here will actually secrete a clear fluid that cleanses the urethra, changes the pH of the urethra, right? That makes sense? It will also lubricate the tip of the penis. Now, that fluid will end up in the semen, but it was actually produced before ejaculation. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the protection between carrying urine and carrying semen simultaneously. Okay. And it seems to work relatively well because if you don't cleanse the urethra, then the pH for the semen is wrong and it won't cause a fertilization event. And there's 7.5 billion people on this planet, so I guess it's working most of the time, right? There's lots of fertilization events. Like half of us were accidents. Okay. Now, last thing before we get into the reproductive system is micturition. And micturition is the fancy word for voiding or urination or peeing, right? So let's talk about how that's going to occur. You ready? Okay. In order to micturate or pee, let's talk about which muscles should contract and which muscles should relax. What should happen to the detrusor muscle in the wall? Contract. What should happen to the internal urethral sphincter? Relax. And the external urethral sphincter? Relax. And which one are you in control of? Only the external. Now, if you pit those against one another, you will only win if it's a sprint. Because remember how long smooth muscle can maintain a contraction compared to skeletal muscle. So we'll talk about that. All right, so let's talk about the whole process of micturition. So here it's controlled by the brain, but not by mostly the sort of voluntary conscious portions of the brain. So here's what happens. As urine accumulates, it stretches the wall of the urinary bladder, and that sensory input will go to the brain. Specifically, it goes to the pons. The pons is the part of the brain that's controlling urination. And here's what the pons does with that sensory input, is that it sends a parasympathetic output to the detrusor muscles and the internal urethral sphincter. And what it does is say, contract detrusor muscles, relax internal urethral sphincter. However, you get control of whether you're going to pee right then, at least for a while, right? Because you can actually say, okay, nope, contract external urethral sphincter, and then cerebral cortex, say, I'm in the middle of class, I don't have time to pee right now, override the pons. The problem is, as the urinary bladder starts to accumulate more urine, it continues to send more frequent inputs to the pons, right? And the pons goes, pee, I said pee, I said pee. And eventually when the damn thing gets super full, what's going to happen? You're going to pee down your leg if you don't pee, right? There is no real alternative that can be overridden by your cerebral cortex and your teeny tiny external urethral sphincter. So you can decide it's okay, or you can inhibit it for a while. Now, what about those people who have to pee all the damn time and you don't want to take a road trip with them, right? So it is not usually, I mean, there are always anatomical exceptions, but it is not usually related to the size of your bladder. What it is usually related to is your response to bladder stretching. So when your bladder gets stretched and you feel like you're going to pee down your leg if you don't pee, that right? Then you make them stop the car and then nobody goes on road trips with you ever again, okay? But you can actually sort of convince yourself, because this happens during pregnancy, those of us who have been moms. So when I was pregnant, I had to pee like 4 times a night for like obvious anatomical reasons. And then when I had the baby, I still had to pee 4 times a night. I'm like, what the hell is going on? There's nothing in there. What is happening? So I went and asked my doctor. I was like, what is going on? He's like, you don't actually have to pee. You just trained yourself that you have to pee. And you have to retrain yourself that you don't have to pee. I'm like, but what if I pee? It's in the middle of the night. And he's like, you just have to go through one night and try to say, it's okay, I'm not going to pee the bed. I was like, well, I don't sleep by myself. So this is like a big proposition, right? So I just told my husband, I was like, I'm just trying something, babe. He's trying. He's like, do you want me to like sleep in the guest room? Okay. So I retrained myself, and I only have to pee once a night. Although as I'm getting older, it's going to happen more and more frequently. It's super annoying. Nobody tells you that. It's ugly. All right, so that's how the urinary system works, and then we are going to start with the reproductive system. One of the reasons that the reproductive system is my favorite is because of the state that we live in, which is an abstinence-centered state that has some restrictions on what we can teach people in public schools that are outrageous. We have some restrictions that even other states don't have. First off, your teachers are not doing a bad job of teaching you the reproductive system. If they did a better job, they would actually lose their jobs. Because in Utah, you are not allowed to cover certain things. First of all, you are not allowed to touch on anything related to sex for pleasure, right? You are not allowed to give any of the details of birth control. And if you are in Provo, you are not even allowed to acknowledge the existence of sex outside of marriage, which must be really confusing to those kids whose parents aren't married. Like, where the hell did you come from? Freaking magic, man. That's where you came from. I don't even know. And up until, I think it was just the summer, maybe July, you weren't allowed to mention anything about homosexuality or transsexuality unless you mentioned it in a negative light, which can be, yes. And here's one that only Utah has. Only Utah, the only state that prohibits teachers, educators, from answering direct questions from students if the material is not in the curriculum. So for instance, if a kid asks you a direct question about, I want to understand what intersex is, like how is it like the development of the anatomy can be in between male and female, not allowed to answer the question. Am I allowed to ask you something about condoms? You're not allowed to answer a question about condoms. If they did, they were risking their job for you. So we end up with a really high teen pregnancy rate, super high teen pregnancy. And I know some of you guys get pregnant on purpose, but do you know you can't give those damn babies back? I just want you to know that, right? Okay. You're like, oh, 19, it'll be good to have a baby. You will have a baby forever if you have a baby at 19. You can't leave them in the yard like a puppy. Somebody's going to arrest you. So we have a really high teen pregnancy rate. We have a really high STD rate, too, especially considering that all of you say you're not having sex. I don't know how the hell that works. I think this is something that really should be changed, but people don't listen to me. I just vote, and my box isn't hooked up to anything. Go ahead.
My 8th grade health class, I asked about condoms, and I got heavily reprimanded for that.
You
I
did?
did. I got sent to the principal's office. I had to call my mom. And it
You,
was
why on earth would you be reprimanded for asking a fact-based question?
Our health teacher also got fired.
Your health teacher got fired? Are you kidding?
Similar but different, but similar.
Yeah, that's why I couldn't do.
That's why I don't teach like young grades, and of course I swear too much, and they fire me too. But okay, so let's start out with some things that a lot of us don't know, and I had to go back and research to figure this out. First off, I want us to talk about how you got to be a sex at all, right? How you went from indifferent to male or female, or eventually we'll talk about how you get to be something in between. And then I'll try to do a decent job, although I have to acknowledge that I get out of my realm of expertise when I want to talk about the difference between sex and gender, right? And we were all sort of taught different terminology when we were growing up, so we're having to relearn these. I made a point of trying to educate myself on all the science because I had a student who was trans, and I realized my level of ignorance when I was trying to teach. So I went back and researched the literature. I'll try to do a good job. I might make mistakes. So sex has to do with anatomy and science. It has to do with chromosomes, it has to do with hormones, it has to do with structures, right? Gender has to do with how you interact socially, right? And sometimes the two agree, and sometimes they don't, right? So what if, for instance, you had all of the anatomy and hormonal components that said you were going to be a female, but you don't identify as female? Then that person might identify themselves as trans, right? And if all of it agrees, you're cis. Do you know cisgender versus transgender? Have you ever heard that before? So cisgender is when your sex and your gender overlap, right? And transgender is something different. And then there's a lot of other words that I don't know how to use properly. Okay, so why do I teach about this at all? Because people get really confused about the difference between sex and gender, and then sexuality, right? Which is a whole different set of terms. I'll tell you what I really know is I know the anatomy. When I get out of my depth, I will tell you that I'm out of my depth, and then I'll tell you what the questions are without pretending that I have the answers, okay? All right, so let's talk about how you got to be a sex. So what we all started out with is really indeterminate anatomical sex. You actually started out with the capacity to be either one, and then your hormonal environment is primarily what changes you from being one to the other. So let's show you a couple of different ways of addressing it. This is your internal reproductive tracts, and this is about weeks 5 to 6 post-implantation, right? And then please note where you're going to end up. If you are an anatomically typical female, what you're going to end up with is a vagina, a uterus, and fallopian tubes, right? So what's going to happen in an anatomically typical female is you are going to start out with this pink duct. That one is going to continue its development. If the pink one continues its development, you'll end up anatomically female on the inside. Does that make sense? However, if you're an anatomically typical male, you start out the same way, but then you start going down the male pathway, and the purple ducts start to develop instead of the pink ducts, right? The pink ducts degenerate, the purple ducts start to develop. These purple ducts will eventually become the vas deferens and the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland, right? Okay. But you didn't actually have an anatomical sex before that. Now, how many determinants are there of biological sex? There are your sex chromosomes, XX versus XY. Everybody knows those, right? There are the type of gonads. Are they testes or are they ovaries? There are your hormones. Do you have a preponderance of testosterone after puberty, or do you have a preponderance of estrogen after puberty, right? And we both have both hormones. We just have different proportions of them, right? Okay, and then there's your internal reproductive structures and your external reproductive structures, okay? So there's the internal ones, and we'll talk about the continued development of those in just a second. And then let's look at the external ones. Here's how you all started out externally. This is week 6 post-implantation, so the woman would be about 7 weeks pregnant right then, right? So 7 weeks after she had sex. It usually takes about a week to do implantation. Everybody all right with that? Okay, so this is week 6. And the homologous structures, you know the word homologous, right? Homologous are the same developmental or evolutionary structures. The homologous structures are going to end up the same color. Okay, so here are the homologous structures that you are going to see developing. This is about week 12. Notice that you start getting something that develops a little bit like a penis but isn't fully there. This is about, this is about week 20. And about week 20, you can see that the glands of the clitoris and the glands of the penis are homologous structures. What is homologous to the scrotum? Labia majora. What is homologous to the skin that forms the shaft of the penis? Labia minora. Does that make sense? Okay, so these are homologous structures. So now let's talk about how you actually make the switch from one place to the other. You ready? Okay, so the internal genitalia start from those two sets of ducts. Okay. I hate it when it doesn't let me blow it up. Still not let me. Okay. Let's just do it this way. Come on, computer. Okay, so you start out with these two sets of ducts. So let's talk about an XX fetus and then an XY fetus. If you're an XX fetus, this is kind of the default. So in humans, the default anatomical sex is female-ish. Now, it's not usually going to be a fully functional female, but external genitalia will look female and the internal genitalia will be almost set up properly. So what's going to happen is in a female, the pink one will continue to develop and the purple one will degenerate. So let's learn the names of the ducts. The pink ducts are called paramesonephric ducts or Mullerian ducts. So keep that word Mullerian in your mind, okay? The purple ducts will become male structures. They're called Wolffian ducts, which is easier for me to remember, because if you had to guess in your mind which sex the wolf was associated with, I mean, you've seen cartoons, right? It's going to be male, right? So Wolffian ducts are male. They're also called mesonephric ducts. If those continue the development, you will actually be male. So let's figure out how this occurs. So how do you get to be male or female? By the way, your notes are a little bit different because I updated these. I'll put up the new ones today or tomorrow. Okay, I just had to go study some more stuff. Okay, so here's the deal. Your undifferentiated gonads will become ovaries or testes. Your ovaries and testes are the same structure. Notice they started out the same, right? Eventually, if they develop into testes, they'll drop through the inguinal canal, but they are the same anatomical structure. Your glans penis is going to be homologous to your glans clitoris. Your scrotum is going to be homologous to your labia majora. And you've got internal erectile structures and glandular structures that are also homologous, but we haven't learned those yet. We'll get those in just a second. So how the heck does this work? Okay, so the default anatomical sex in humans is female. And it seems as if the presence of an active Y chromosome is what really starts changing the anatomical development. Because, of course, all of us have an X chromosome, yes? One or more X chromosomes, but not all of us have a Y chromosome. So one of the things that happens with the Y chromosome is there is a gene that is only on the Y chromosome. It's called the SRY gene, and it activates at about 5 to 6 weeks gestation, right? And what it does is starts to initiate these undifferentiated gonads to turning into testes. Now, they're not going to drop for a really long time, but they're going to start to function slightly differently under the presence of the SRY gene. Does that make sense? Okay. The next thing that happens is those maturing sort of testes, like as they just start to mature, those are going to activate another gene, and that gene is called for Mullerian inhibiting hormone. Now, which ducts were female? Mullerian. So what is going to happen in a male is when the MIH gene turns on, you will start to degenerate the Mullerian ducts, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so now we're trying to develop a little boy. That's what we're trying to do, to try to develop an anatomically typical little boy. So what we have done is we've said, okay, I think we might want to be testes, but we haven't really changed much about our anatomy. And then they are going to say, okay, degenerate the Mullerian ducts. And then what's going to happen is the undifferentiated gonads are going to continue their development into testes. Then what is going to happen also is the labia are going to start to fuse to form a scrotum. Right? All of this is under influence ultimately of the Y chromosome. And the placenta causes the fetal gonads to secrete sex hormones. If you secrete a whole bunch of testosterone at exactly the right point during pregnancy, then what's going to happen is everything will continue development of the male. And you'll end up making a penis instead of a clitoris. Right? Okay. If, however, none of those first things happen, then you're going to continue the development of the female, and then eventually she will start to secrete estrogen during pregnancy, and it will put the rest of the female stuff into position. Does that make sense? So really, the default is to just sort of develop along the female path, and you have to switch 2 switches at exactly the right point in development to make a male, right? You have to switch on the SRY gene, right? And then it has to turn on, actually 3 switches. SRY, MIH, and then testosterone, right? So does it surprise you at all that most people who are intersex, in which their anatomical development was not quite exactly anatomically typical male or anatomically typical female, does it surprise you at all that most people who are intersex are actually XY? Does that surprise you? You have to switch a lot of switches to make an anatomical male, right? Does that make sense? Most of them. There are a bunch of different ways that it can occur, but most of them who are intersex between male and female. Go ahead.
So could that happen with, I had a friend who was getting testosterone pellets, and the doctor inserted them in her, and then she found out she was pregnant?
Yes, so hold on to that question for just a second, okay? All right, so it's a really good question. So what do we know and what do we think? what we know is in humans and other mammals that have the same sex determination system as us, XXXY, XX being female, XY being male. Birds are opposite. The birds are, the males are the double gamete. They've got the same gametes, and females have the other one. But in mammals that are similar to us, anatomic maleness seems to be the presence of testosterone. It's not the absence of estrogen. It's the presence of testosterone, and specifically the presence of testosterone at a certain point in development will make you continue and your development as a male. So anatomic femaleness is not the presence of estrogen, it's the absence of testosterone, right? So what is the big difference between males and females during development? It's the Y chromosome, isn't it? And the Y chromosome starts all of this, okay? Now, let's get to her question. So that means that if you shot up a woman who was pregnant at exactly the wrong time in development, could you potentially switch the anatomic sex of her baby? You certainly can. It doesn't usually happen with pellets because pellets are lower concentration, but you know when women shoot themselves up with testosterone because, I don't know, maybe they're trying to transition, or maybe they're like doing it for muscle mass building, right? Then it's high concentrations of testosterone. Does that make sense? You can flip the anatomic sex of the baby by doing that. Now, we don't do that experimentally to humans because who the hell would volunteer for that? We have done it experimentally to animals, right, with the same sex determination system. And it ends up with some strange anatomy. You can end up with intersex development in which they're kind of in between. And then what about their gender identification? That's still a bit of an issue, right? Because gender identification, the research suggests that it happens at a different point in development. And then what about their sexuality, which is a whole different question, right? So we don't experiment on humans like that. So it has to be kind of anecdotal information that we get if that ever occurs. But you definitely don't want to have some testosterone pellets in you when you're pregnant, okay? Probably not a good time to do that. Okay, all right. So if a pregnant woman is injected with testosterone at the right point in development, you can have an XX fetus develop as an anatomic male. Now, what if, and this is the one that's really interesting to me, what if you have a situation in which you've got an XY fetus with insensitive or improperly formed testosterone receptors so that they can't respond to testosterone? Do you understand what I'm saying? So you make testosterone, you have a Y chromosome, you get everything started, and you make testosterone, but the receptors for testosterone do not function normally, so you don't respond to testosterone. Does that make sense? So let's try to predict in that situation, and that is a genetic condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Okay, so let's try to predict in that situation what would happen internally. So you've got an XY fetus, and the only thing that is different is that the testosterone receptors don't work, right? So you still get SRY turned on, yes, okay? And the testes still start developing like they do, right? And then do you still make MIH? Yeah, MIH is a totally different gene, right? And so do you degenerate these female ducts? Yeah, you do, right? And then what you do is you try to hit it with testosterone to go from here to here, but you're insensitive to testosterone. So what happens is you kind of start, you end up looking between these two. You actually never get the continued development of the female. So basically take this one right here, okay, and take off the uterus and the fallopian tubes, and you'll imagine what the internal reproductive tract would look like. You all started out with a blind vagina. Everybody did, right? Everybody starts out with a blind vagina. It just ends up forming the urethra in males, and it ends up staying separate in females, right? So she's got a blind vagina that ends about the cervix. She has no uterus and no fallopian tubes. She's got undecided gonads, right? They never really got all the way one way or the other. Okay, so that's the internal reproductive tract of androgen insensitivity syndrome. Now tell me what the external genitalia would look like with someone with androgen insensitivity syndrome. They're insensitive to testosterone. What happens here? If you're insensitive to testosterone, this is what you look like. This is the default anatomical external genitalia in humans, right? Okay, so now you have a baby, right? And this baby is born, and her external genitalia looks like that, and you name her Susie, and you don't go looking for a uterus, because that's not what we do, right? And then you raise this baby, right? And these girls with androgen insensitivity syndrome, they look like girls, and girls and boys really aren't very different until you hit puberty, right? Neither sex actually secretes very much of reproductive hormones between development and puberty. So you just grow up as just like a kid, right? And then you hit puberty, but of course she's not going to menstruate, right? She doesn't have a uterus, right? She's not going to ovulate because her ovaries never continued their development, right? And so eventually somebody's going to take her to the doctor and figure out that she doesn't have a uterus, because it's not very hard for a gynecologist to figure out that you don't have a uterus, right? Or else they're really bad at their job. And you've got some really delicate information to tell, let's say, a 15 or 16-year-old girl, right? Because you might not take her when she doesn't menstruate when she's 12, but by the time she's 15 or 16, you're like, let's go, check. So she's XY. She's never going to have kids, biologically, right? Okay. And she also has to have surgery because those undifferentiated gonads have really high incidence of cancer. And then after she has surgery, she has to replace estrogen for the rest of her life. Okay. So one of the interesting things with this particular disorder is that they actually do end up hitting puberty, and they make a whole bunch of testosterone, but I don't know if you guys know this, estrogen is actually produced from testosterone. Okay. So if you make a whole bunch of testosterone and don't use it, you end up converting it into estrogen. So she actually grows relatively tall, a little later than other girls, because boys hit puberty a little later, right? And then she's got relatively large breasts because of the testosterone, or because of the estrogen. So she's like a little supermodel, right? Supermodel who doesn't menstruate, freaking power right there. You're like, what the hell? This is the best thing ever. With the exception of the fact that that's really delicate information to tell an adolescent, right? And if you end up telling your BFF who happens to like the same boy, then you can end up with suicidal situations. And there certainly have been in that situation. So the one thing that I find really interesting about this too is this suggests, but again, in this particular realm, I do not have this information. I don't have this science. I have a good question about it and this suggestion. So here's something interesting about these girls. The vast majority of them identify as female. They are XY, they had high levels of testosterone, but their testosterone receptors did not work, right? As a matter of fact, something above 94% of them identify as female. So this is a really, really high percentage of people with androgen sensitivities. Of course, the sample size is pretty small, but anyway, so this suggests, but does not confirm, that gender identity may also be the response to high levels of testosterone. Does that make sense? High levels of testosterone. And they think that the gender identity actually happens a little later in development, so high levels of testosterone a little bit later. So do you see how it suggests that, but it certainly isn't conclusive, and it just suggests that perhaps if these girls do not respond to high levels of testosterone, and yet they have high levels of testosterone and they are XY, then what it is high levels of testosterone can cause you to gender identify as male, and the default gender identity may be female in humans. So it's just one way to think about these. These girls don't usually, although they're XY, I tried to read about this. I read a research article about it recently. They're XY, the vast majority of them identify as female, but they do not consider themselves transgender. Most of them consider themselves intersex, which means something different about their sexuality and their anatomy, like disagreeing between those things. So why do I bring this up at all? If we have one anatomical and physiological way that we can understand that a person might end up being trans, then do you think there are probably others that have something to do with science and not just something to do with something that you could judge very quickly and brush off? So what this tells me is that there's a hell of a lot that I don't know, but I'm curious about it. And there's probably some science that we will figure out about it at some point in the near future. Okay, so what we will talk about next time is we'll talk about hermaphroditism and pseudohermaphroditism, and then we'll also talk about intersex, and then we'll get into the normal female anatomical development and the normal male anatomical development.